Hey everyone, Joey here, aka Animus, and first off, thank you all so much for 1,000 subscribers. I thought it'd be fun if I just did a little kinda Q&A video, I guess, so link in description if you want to post a little comment for that. But today is a Patreon request from Roberto Diaz. I'm going to be reviewing every album by the artist Cacola. So, well, you know, my third Patreon requested discography review, and this time for an artist who I had absolutely no preconceived ideas about, which is a pretty fun change, I guess. Cacola is an independent electronic music artist from the US who's been going since the mid-2010s with a variety of styles ranging from chiptune to breakbeat to vaporwave and down-tempo and even mashup music. I'm not surprised she'd never been on my radar before, but she seems to have built a sizable community of fans online. 7,000 monthly listeners is definitely nothing to be sniffed at. Excitingly, the person who requested this video is also in contact with the artist herself, who might end up watching this video, so of course I'm not going to be any less critical as a result, but it's super cool to be in such close proximity with the artist I'm talking about. So Cacola's history as an artist is a little bit complicated. She put out 4 albums under the name Soul Frequency, but since these have been virtually delisted from existence, and I'd rather go into greater depth on a smaller number of albums than the other way round, I've decided to limit this video to just the 9 main studio LPs under the name Cacola. So yeah, I went into this discography with no particular expectations of any sort, but an open mind to potentially discovering some new music worth keeping around. What did I get with Cacola? So with my feelings on this artist being a completely blank canvas waiting to be filled in, this first album under the Cacola name had quite a bit of responsibility in setting up my overall expectations for what I was getting in for, and between this record's understated visual presentation and the fact that she apparently made it as a teenager, I had a sneaking worry that it might fit into the category of some albums I've been sent in by the artists themselves before on Patreon, where things are just a little too rough around the edges, amateurish, and not fully formed yet for me to properly get much out of them. Cacola's status as a developing artist with certain limitations to what she can put to record does manifest itself in the overall sound of the album, but overall, I was surprised at what a clear vision there often is at the core of these tracks and at the strength of some of the songwriting. Even if the presentation of her debut is very raw and Cacola definitely doesn't yet feel like a fully formed artist and producer here, I could always feel a strong sense of ambition and creative purpose pervading this album, and I enjoyed every track to some extent. Going piece by piece, there's not much of a through line or logical flow as an album here. It's more of a wide-ranging collection of tracks in whatever styles interested her, almost like a mixtape really. First off, the opener and title track is a really nice start to the album, a gentle and melancholy down-tempo piece building from soft chimes and a low drone into glitchy percussion. It's nicely produced and well balanced, and I kind of wish it was allowed to develop further over a longer runtime. However, with the next track, Love and Memes Both Must Die, the album suddenly swerves into a sort of bombastic synthesized metal style. I have to be honest and say I'm not super keen on this track. The MIDI horns are a bit tacky, the mix feels close to being crushed under its own weight, and its placement in the track listing makes very little sense, or at least there's not really much of an attempt at a flow between these two very tonally different pieces at the beginning of the album. But I do enjoy how melodramatic and off the rails it gets toward the end. The artist clearly had lots of fun throwing wacky ideas into this track, which is nice to hear, of course. Also, Yellow and Purple, which shows up later in the track listing, does a better job of integrating heavy guitars and making itself sound big and weighty, but not overbearing. I think my favourite piece on this whole album, though, was the Daily Sequence, which, like the opener, has a lovely simplicity to it. It begins with a very pretty loop of what sounds almost like a music box, then brings in an acoustic drum beat that occasionally stutters and glitches, while the mix gradually grows in scale. Once again though, I think she cut off a really strong idea too early. It feels like this track ends abruptly right on the brink of what could have been a big emotional high. More of this type of thing, please. Now, Cacola actually does extend out the final 3 tracks to between 6 and 10 minutes, and I was looking forward to seeing how she used this wider canvas for her music. First we get Found Footage, another chilled out piece that doesn't undergo any big shifts or developments, but I was happy to be immersed in its atmosphere for a while. The Song of the Giants, however, suddenly raises the ambition and stakes of the album tenfold. It goes through multiple phases over the course of 8 minutes, trying to sound huge and epic with rising and falling tension and synths soloing all over the place. However, it still feels like Cacola hasn't had enough experience to work as well with such a heavy, layered sound as she does with a smaller set of elements. Also, it sounds like a compressor's been placed on the master, which is sort of rough and jagged and trying its best to cope with the number of sounds that have been thrown at it. It does unfortunately detract from the sense of spaciousness that the track is going for, but she does show an admirable level of ambition here and some strong ideas that could be better developed later down the line. Similar things can be said for our closer, Death. Yes, she literally had the balls to call it Death, but the production and mixing issues are definitely less pronounced here, and I find this a pretty satisfying closer that justifies its 10-minute runtime impressively well. It's driven on by a strong melody with a sense of drama and heightened emotion, and spends most of its runtime just building and building until the tune is practically overtaken by noise. And then the final 2 minutes are like a nice little credits roll moment for the whole LP. Perhaps you could call the louder sections of this track overbearing, but I'm pretty sure the intent was to overwhelm the senses. I'm definitely not averse to someone drowning their melody in a wall of sound as an artistic technique. So yeah, Island 1 definitely throws you around a lot as a front-to-back listen. Its sequencing of different ideas and styles is not seamless, and it often finds Cacola reaching for a larger sound than she can achieve at this point in her artistic development. But as debuts from such young artists go, I'd say this was comfortably above average in the strength of its ideas and the promise it delivered. Subworld Unknown is the second album currently listed on her Bandcamp and Spotify, though it was originally put out under the name LS Disorder. This was actually released in the same year as Island 1, but there's very noticeable stylistic differences between the two records. This one goes for a much darker, more raw aesthetic. And it's also a fair bit weaker than her debut in my eyes. There's much less sonic and compositional variety. The compression issues become more persistent and unignorable, further knocking any sense of polish. There's much less to note about individual tracks than on her previous album, so this segment will probably end up being shorter, but I'll just pick out those that gave me the most to say. Beatlemania 2K4 tries to be a heavy, brooding opener with a noisy payoff. The central riff is pretty good and I like the idea of this track, but unfortunately at the climax the mix is so shrill and off balance that you can't properly make out what's going on, and it's just not very nice to listen to. Shooter's got a catchy melody and decently hard-hitting production. The track where I could most distinctly remember how it went after listening to the album, so definitely one of the better cuts on here. No Hellfire Hot Enough benefits from a smaller scale sound, believe it or not, and more of a melodic focus. This might be my favourite track in the bunch, and its video game-like sound is a precursor to what she'll do on a much stronger record a little later down the line. Later on, I Want to Be a Part of Your World goes for a similar style, but despite it sticking around for 7 minutes, I find it pretty hard to recall how this one sounds. Godslave is one of the most flagrantly atonal cuts on here, with dramatic synth leads going over a stomping beat. It's alright for what it's going for. Hope in Alignment acts quite similarly to Death as a closer. Once again, Cacola tries to build this track into a searing, propulsive climax to round the whole experience off, but weirdly, it's a clear step down from how her first album ended. You can't properly hear these nice melodies she's writing because they're buried too far under cluttered and abrasive production. I feel a bit like I'm listening to a poor quality MP3 rip of Sea of Voices by Porter Robinson. Of course, all the faults in the album's production and mixing are not unexpected given the artist's lack of experience at this point. It was just disappointing to hear a step down in most departments after the genuinely solid Island 1. Since these two records were released in such quick succession, I guess what might have happened is that both of them were compiled from the same pool of tracks, and Subworld Unknown just follows a style that works less well for Cacola in my opinion. Or maybe it was thrown together quite quickly after the release of her first album, I don't know, but this was a bit of a slapdash listen and my least favourite album of hers overall. Onwards and upwards. Before we get into the next mainline album, I want to quickly mention this EP, Flower, which is significant for beginning the running theme of Cacola using highly recognisable samples in her music. I should also mention this was her first release on the Business Casual label, which I recognised as being home to the Plunderphonics artist Chance De La Soul, so that's a cool achievement. Flower is kind of mashup music, albeit underpinned by plenty of Cacola's own production, which has improved greatly in the 2 years since her second album, even if the arrangements on here don't show it off much. The tricky thing is it doesn't consistently lean into the silliness that the mashup genre lends itself to. For example, the track Darling Sky is mostly just a regular Cacola instrumental that's completely sincere in building a sense of drama, but this is immediately followed up by the ironically titled Wonderwall sampling musical shitpost that is an original thought, which honestly I find pretty grating to listen to. On the whole, I do enjoy this set of tracks more than Subworld Unknown, and they certainly show technical development, but mainly this EP just comes across as a playground for various ideas, which the artist will later refine individually and make more coherent. The first time I went through Cacola's discography, I did just go album by album and skipped listening to Flower, and that EP definitely provides more of a logical through line between her second and third albums, but the first time I heard Prelude to You, it kind of caught me off guard with how much it shook up her overall sound. It's chock full of breakbeats, bright melodies, and sparkling synth textures, and an overall peppy atmosphere that was kind of a breath of fresh air at points after some of the dour notes that Subworld Unknown hit. It's far better produced than her last LP, and it's pretty hard in places. Just look at the opener, The Whole World Is Watching, which is easily a standout of her discography thus far. It races along with vibrant jazzy chords over a skittering beat, constantly shifting over the course of its runtime, halving its tempo and adding in fun little pieces of ear candy before culminating in a huge acidy payoff at the very end. You can easily tell that she had a fun time making this track, and the results are really entertaining. However, immediately afterwards, samples start to find their way into the album. There's at least one on most tracks here, the biggest example being Popstar, which is a collab with another small artist called Star Sculptor. This is basically a mashup or remix of Mr. Brightside and Somebody Told Me by The Killers and Can't Stop by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. It's gaudy to say the least. Our closer, My Voice Is Different But I Can Still Sing, also heavily dated itself with a Megalovania sample. Even if these samples work perfectly well in a musical sense and are obviously more than a little tongue-in-cheek, I personally just can't fully get behind this type of thing. It just feels a bit naff. Later in her discography, she will find a pretty radical way of making this type of big, obvious sample work, but in the middle of a regular Cacola studio album that's not overtly humorous, I find it breaks the immersion and cheapens the overall effect of the music, often undercutting my enjoyment of some well-made tracks. All this is not to say that I came out of this album feeling hugely frustrated or anything. In addition to the really fun opener, The Girl on the Ice Cream Wrapper is a fun amalgamation of trance and jazz with some snazzy shifts in key and meter that show off the best of Cacola's songwriting abilities. Broken Bell is another track that's sustained by its sense of movement and progression. This one sounds lush and catchy enough that I was fine with its subtle integration of the guitar lead from Bangarang. So Prelude to You is a pretty messy album that goes against my personal taste in a lot of places. But there's plenty of positives here. At 8 tracks and 37 minutes, it's a well-paced listen that doesn't outstay its welcome. It's the best sounding Cacola album yet, and an important step toward where she's headed with later music. Whoa! Coming out of that previous record, I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it definitely wasn't a sprawling 2-hour double album with cinematic aspirations. I wasn't bursting with excitement going into this since I didn't have full confidence that she could nail a sound that would keep me engaged for this length of time, but after listening, I'll just say right off the bat that this is easily my favourite album of hers that I've talked about so far, and a strong contender for the best overall. In terms of sound, it's fuller and more impactful than anything she's made thus far, but also quite deliberately retro and video game-like, so that when parts of the production do feel a little rough around the edges, it kind of makes sense in context. Plus, there's easily the strongest sense of atmosphere pervading this album out of anything she's made up until this point. In her Spotify bio, she mentions making tracks to imagine music videos or movies in your head to, and this is the album where I definitely most see that applying. Okay, we've got a lot of music to talk about here. The Demon is the album's cinematic opening credits moment, building a sense of drama that continues into the second track, Red Eyes, where a 7/8 time signature spices things up in a very enjoyable way. The following 2 tracks are a little weaker. FFM uses a pretty basic MIDI piano at the beginning, and sounds a little bland and awkward initially, but develops into something with a nice groovy flow with some solid weight behind it. Builds some pleasant vibes. Days Go By has some nice crunchy guitars and a jazzy chord progression, but its crowded mix prevents the final payoff from hitting the way it potentially could have. Then The Plague, The Cancer marks a tonal shift towards something grander and more intense for this album. Over the course of 7 minutes, we go from a beatless, chiptune-y excursion to a bombastic, explosive finale, complete with metal guitars and huge drum hits. There's a lot of potential here if the production could just breathe a bit more. The following track, Lit Fuse, is her most popular on Spotify, and I totally see why. It's got a super strong and memorable melody, a striking 5/4 rhythm, and a lovely cascade of synths toward the end, followed by what sounds like a marching band inside a console. It's a pretty great track, and I could easily see it as her, signature piece. Then Hyperdeath has some big bombastic chords and searing arpeggios and an almost overblown sense of drama. It's a pretty fun track. ... has an understated title but is absolutely not musically understated in any way. It's an epic 20-minute piece that manages impressively not to drag over its runtime. Though if you're looking for huge pieces of music on this record, look no further than our closer, The Angel. If you're looking at it as just one entity, which is how it's listed on Bandcamp, it's absolutely monolithic at 50 minutes. This thing goes so many different places that I prefer it divided into 5 parts like it is on Spotify. It takes you all the way from ambience to the album's usual symphonic video game-like sounds, to more driving, techno-influenced sections, to friggin' gabba. I'll just about excuse the not-so-welcome return of the Mr. Brightside sample, even if I'm not wowed by the Angel the Demon all the way through, and I personally definitely need to split the listening experience into two halves so that the sound doesn't wear out on me. The fact that Cacola had the ambition and drive to pull off an album like this is seriously admirable. Many of the most memorable ideas and exciting tunes of her whole discography find a home on this album, carried by her strongest production up to this point. It's probably the most compositionally impressive Cacola album, and without a doubt one of the records that I most feel like returning to out of everything I'm discussing in this video. So yeah, I have been complaining about on-the-nose samples throughout basically this whole video, but about that development from the Sound of the Flower EP I've been talking about, how about an entire Cacola mashup album? When I hit play on Amy Rose and realised what I was getting in for, I honestly thought I was gonna struggle to get through this album. But would it be weird if I said this is possibly the most distinctive and memorable record she's ever made? Along with its sequel that I'll get to later. I actually think she could have released this under a different name because it's such a fundamentally different idea to anything she's done on previous LPs. Like I said, prominently using incredibly recognizable samples can really cheapen the overall effect of your music in my eyes, and I still haven't warmed up to the way Cacola uses them in regular cases. But once you base your whole album completely off them, it becomes something entirely different. You wholeheartedly abandon all usual notions of serious musicianship and just embrace the anarchy. You have to acknowledge that there's an art to this style of music. Heck, aside from using less samples and making them all more prominent and recognizable, the mashup genre isn't that different in ethos from Plunderphonics, which has made for some of my favourite music of all time. Good sampling is awesome, and for the vast majority of this album, Cacola does a really good job at making everything work musically out of the most absurd combinations of tracks. Making for a listening experience that's both ridiculous and ridiculously fun, especially if you're a music nerd like myself. This is one of the cleverest stupid albums I've heard in my life, and I honestly think it's pretty great. I love when I just get a new haircut in the middle of a video. A Gift to Us All is closer to the sound of Prelude to You than any other Cacola album, but better in every department. It's got that same bright, colourful energy and is equally unpredictable, but this time the ride is just a lot more fun overall. Many of the tracks on here are given generous runtimes, wide canvases where the artist can get dynamic and even mash different genres together. The overall sound is a major positive over previous records of hers. Through making Amy Rose, she seems to have honed her production abilities to the point where pretty much everything sounds professional and sufficiently hard-hitting. Opener The Perfect Shape is 8 minutes of zany, driving drum and bass, which carry across a sense of perpetual motion and development, keeping you locked into its flow. Unused Assets is another super high-octane number that builds up into a sugary hook, before suddenly swerving into a full-on metal breakdown that's as comically unexpected as it is genuinely hard-hitting, then eventually winding up somewhere between trance and happy hardcore. It's delightfully bonkers stuff. Flowers and Snakes is the album's centerpiece in both placement and duration, and I'd say it just about sustains its energy over 10 minutes. It doesn't undergo any dramatic shifts, but it ebbs and flows enough to keep you engaged and packs in an impressive number of fun hooks, including a sample of Ne-Yo's Closer, which felt significantly more cohesive in context than the sampling work on Prelude to You. On that topic, samples are used sparingly and tastefully across this album. Except for on Birthday Girl, which was the album's one dud for me, unfortunately. I appreciate having a slower tempo cut, and it starts off sounding pleasant with some nice chord progressions and a neat time signature change, but even though a more driving beat's introduced in the final third, it just doesn't quite have the momentum to work over nearly 7 minutes. And then it samples Welcome to the Black Parade. I'm a pretty big fan of My Chemical Romance for what it's worth, but this one song has been so memed to death that it just made for a bit of an eye roll moment for me. Moving on from there though, luckily the record picks up again for its last 3 tracks. How to take complete control of everyone and everything is just as elaborate and frenetic as you'd hope based on its title. Perhaps it could vary the musical terrain a little more over the course of 8 minutes, but it certainly maintains a strong sense of momentum and is full of that sugar rush feeling that I feel is the album's strongest asset. Tapers is a rare vocal cut courtesy of Moksha Drip. It takes a while to get going, and neither artist brings anything super outstanding to the table here, but an energetic 303-driven payoff definitely leaves things on a satisfying note. It was an interesting choice to put Age of Disintegration as the closer rather than one of these more climactic multi-phased pieces, but I guess you can see it as a neat little down-tempo epilogue to round things off. So Cacola isn't delivering anything super unique or mind-blowing on this album, but it's just one of the most consistently enjoyable records in her catalogue. Just the one dud out of 8 in my eyes, which is not bad at all, and on the whole it's just a colourful and energetic listen that I'd pretty easily recommend. Well, what do you know? Another helping of Cacola mashups! And a generous one at that, adding up to a whopping 80 minutes. I was a little apprehensive that the sheer scale of this album might cause its style to wear off on me, but no, this is an improvement over Amy Rose in basically every department. It's even more musically astute in its combinations of samples. It can catch you off guard how well some of these completely unrelated pieces work together. In the midst of this absurdist pop avalanche, one moment you're laughing out loud at these ridiculous combinations, the next you're genuinely locked into its tight grooves and interlocking harmonies. The track Super Ultra Mega Ballad X, which I've used as the clip in the little title card, was almost left off the album, and I'm so glad it wasn't, because there's just all these great pieces of 90s electronic music that somehow just synergize perfectly, and it's genuinely kind of euphoric to listen to. Potentially my favourite piece of Cacola mashup music, full stop. She mentioned that on this album, compared to Amy Rose, she gravitated less towards what would be most recognisable to the widest range of people, and more towards what she instinctively felt fit together nicely in a musical sense, and that definitely comes across here. She's just super committed to a completely silly idea, and I'm absolutely here for it. There's a level of skill here that should definitely not be dismissed. So basically all my thoughts on the album's predecessor also apply here, so there's not a whole lot extra to add, but here's a random selection of the most awesome, ridiculous, baffling, and hilarious moments from the record.
Chill out, what you yelling for? Lay back, it's all been done before.
So to sum it up, I definitely wouldn't casually put on Ruby Rose every day, and 80 minutes may be pushing it a little for this type of album, but it entertained and impressed me basically from front to back. If you're gonna listen to just one of these mashup albums, I'd say make it this one. And finally, we get a pair of albums released in very quick succession last year. Alive Here is probably her most ambitious album since The Angel the Demon. Looking at the track listing and seeing just 3 pieces ranging from 6 to 25 minutes gave me a mix of excitement and apprehension. But it turns out that none of these are particularly slow-paced or monolithic either. Much like The Angel, they're constantly moving somewhere, even undergoing bombastic shifts in genre. The album is a little too scattershot to click with me as a whole, but it's definitely home to some of Cacola's most compelling ideas. The Watcher is our grand 24-minute opener, featuring an artist called Sandtimer. Now, I assumed this was just an underground artist without much of a name for themselves, but apparently this is a pseudonym for the vaporwave artist Hong Kong Express, who, as one half of the duo 2814, was partially responsible for one of my favourite ambient records of the last decade. Oh my god! And after I'd written most of these notes, it even got released on the Dream Catalogue label, one of the biggest in all of vaporwave. Which is just an incredibly impressive achievement from this artist. So the vaporwave influence does become pretty apparent right off the bat. The first 4 minutes are your standard fare, slushy, slowed down 80s pop. But then we transition into a mounting drone along with pianos that honestly sound pretty epic and expansive, before the 2 artists basically rip half the vocals straight from Everybody Wants to Rule the World, virtually unaltered. Can we please not do this? Okay, I'm sorry, I'll stop complaining. The track still ends up being quite an exciting ride, rising into a well-earned climax midway with stacks of blaring synths underpinned by steady percussion. Then there's a sudden left turn into big bombastic shoegaze with heavy acoustic drums crashing all over the place. Aside from a slight lack of soundstage, this section genuinely sounds really cool and is a major highlight on the album. Especially since it swerves once again into a last burst of frenetic drum and bass before the whole thing fades into the distance gradually. Finally, there's a dramatic monologue, apparently in the voice of the Sandtimer character, which builds up a sense of cosmic wonder. Spoken word can easily make a track feel a bit awkward, but I think it works really nicely here. So, musically all over the place, with some compelling ideas mixed in with a few personally not so enjoyable ones, but overall I respect the ambition and enjoy the roller coaster this track takes you on. I've got similar feelings about Recycle Zero featuring Rat Jesu, which is equally long and winding, but because this track has more of a sustained focus and its one obvious sample isn't emphasized as much, I think I like it a little more personally. Similarly to The Watcher, we start with low-pitched vaporwave vocals and pretty pianos rising into a more percussive section. My favourite part of the track is probably the section between 7 and 10 minutes, which has a really nice, crunchy, hard-hitting beat and lots of forward momentum. But then we get another bombastic rock passage, complete with proggy arpeggios all over the place, once again capped off by a dramatic beatless outro. It follows a noticeably similar formula to the previous track, but it holds together well as an overall piece. Finally, we get Void Killer, which isn't nearly as sprawling at 5 minutes. It packs a concentrated punch of atmospheric drum and bass, and we also get a conclusion to the monologuing that began on track 1 with the ominous line, "I created this and I will see it die." Cacola really just seems to be either going full-on cute or full-on death and destruction, and I kinda love it. Clearly the album's going for a sort of cosmic existential drama that's vague enough to be just a little garnish of vibes rather than a rigid story that might bog anything down. I wish the mixing and mastering on this closer allowed for a greater sense of depth and space to convey the heightened drama that the track is going for, but it hits pretty hard musically and is a satisfying conclusion to the record, I'd say. To sum it up, you've got to give credit to the ballsiness of this album sonically and structurally. I definitely see this album clicking with other people more than myself and making for one of the most exhilarating listens in the artist's catalogue potentially. As for me, it's a little too rough around the edges to form a front-to-back experience that I'd want to hold on to, but its boldness and creative diversity led it to be one of the most consistently engaging albums here, and in its best moments it hits pretty hard. Definitely worth giving a shot. And lastly, we arrive at Requiem, which is travelling even further in the vaporwave direction, making for probably one of the most out there sounding listens she's ever made. There's a really consistent nocturnal, almost narcotic atmosphere throughout this thing, and it's probably her darkest record. I love that she went from full-on kawaii aesthetics to what looks like the literal Grim Reaper in the space of a year. Gotta respect the versatility. The 16 tracks on here are very cohesive. It's definitely more about the overall album experience than the individual pieces, and no one track completely wowed me on its own, but nor were there any real hitches, making for a pretty solid, satisfying overall experience, more so than her previous record. First off, I was impressed by the sound of this album. By design, it isn't a hi-fi listen, but it does a solid job at building both a spacious atmosphere and a sense of weight. Plus, the sampling was genuinely well integrated, mostly drawing from more obscure sources and warping them to fit the album's surreal, dusky sound world. Sure, you might hear snatches of Carly Rae Jepsen or Gautier here and there, but they're creatively utilised and don't stick out unflatteringly in context. It reminds me a bit of how Death's Dynamic Shroud have drawn from the more recent pop canon on their last few records and made it work surprisingly well. The album's flow is very smooth, but this isn't to say you don't get a solid amount of variety on here. There's more ambient cuts, more hard-hitting cuts, some distorted guitar work, and even light elements of noise music. For instance, the opener psalm begins and ends in ambient territory, but in between is a shoegazy sensory overload of pitched down vocals and fuzzed out rock. Unending is even denser and noisier, with some metal screams at one point and heavy acoustic drums that eventually give way to a D&B break. It's an odd concoction, but it kind of works for me. Epoch is just a tense, minute-long ambient interlude that's not particularly remarkable on its own, but demonstrates a level of restraint and subtlety that's definitely developed over the course of her discography, and this makes a moment like the explosive, climactic ending of Eve a whole lot more impactful. Picking out my favourite on the album is not much of a challenge, though. Over the course of just 2 minutes, the track Remember genuinely left quite a strong impression on me. The instrumentals under all these layers of phasing, filtering, bit crushing and distortion, but still creates a remarkable sense of depth and atmosphere. Combine that with a raw and melancholic vocal, and the effect is surprisingly evocative and emotionally impactful, doing a lot with a little. Endings is easily the longest track on the album, thanks to a prolonged shift into reverb-laden ambience. It ends on a pensive, uncertain note somewhere between darkness and light, meaning that tonally this would have made perfect sense as a closer. Instead, the album's actual ending is verse, which is basically just 2 minutes of completely dry vocals from Sweet Disposition set to organ chords. And one can definitely assume that this track has a lot of significance for the artist to be placed so emphatically at the end of her record. But this track unfortunately just threw me off a bit right at the last minute, for reasons I've kind of already explained a million times. Still though, an underwhelming finish doesn't stop this from absolutely being one of her better albums overall. There's a depth to both the sound of the album and its emotional qualities that stands out in her discography. It's less immediate and more distant than most of her music, but there's a lot to unlock here with patience. A second listen cemented this in my eyes as a solid front-to-back experience, and a satisfying conclusion to this whole listening journey. And that's all. I can't say that any Cacola album has completely won me over as anything flat out great, but nor can I say that I was remotely bored at any point in making this video. Cacola's passion as a listener and an artist shines through when you hear her work, and she's clearly not one to remain stylistically static or rest on her laurels, bringing in influences from disparate genres that she's obviously enthusiastic about. The Angel the Demon is probably the regular album of hers that I'm most likely to hold on to, but I was really pleasantly surprised that her 2 mashup LPs were genuinely some of her most consistently engaging and impressive work. I very much doubt that Requiem will be the last Cacola album, and hopefully that'll be for the best, because something tells me that her best album might still be in her. I'm glad I looked into this discography, and I'm eager to see what Cacola does in the future. Thanks to Cacola for the tunes, thanks to Roberto Diaz for sending in this request and supporting the channel, thank you all for watching, see you next time.